Thank you, Megan. This is Andy speaking now. I really appreciate the invitation to present here today, and Ben and I have been looking forward to this for a couple of months. We did make a change to our title. We substituted remotely sensed for the word LIDAR in the title because Ben will be speaking some about Landsat data. And I'd just like to make the point now that LIDAR data, as excited as foresters and ecologists are about LIDAR, it isn't going to wholly replace other older types of remotely sensed data like Landsat. And those kinds of imagery can still provide a great complement to LIDAR data. Okay, so the outline today is to go over two different types of disturbance, and I thought that would be a nice approach because they're interesting in their own right, but also to try to highlight the different methodologies we would use to try to quantify disturbance effects on forest canopies. The first case that I'll present is the effect of forest harvest. So that's, of course, a man-made disturbance, and the methodological approach I will present today is comparing before and after LIDAR acquisitions. That's not, it's a fairly new approach because even though LIDAR is becoming more and more widely available, it's not too frequent where we've got multi-temporal LIDAR, or in other words, repeat LIDAR collections a number of years apart. So that's really the ideal scenario for quantifying forest disturbance due to harvest from LIDAR. You could do the same thing with more traditional types of imagery, but you're not going to do as accurate a job as is possible with LIDAR. And then in the second half of the presentation, Ben will present using LIDAR or Landsat data, but from a single date, a single point in time. So, and that's to quantify a more subtle gradual disturbance caused by bark beetle infestation. So different disturbance regimes, and we're taking different methodological approaches here. So the study I'll present took place just outside my window here in Moscow, Idaho. I can look out the window and see Moscow Mountain, and in this slide you're seeing a DTM, a digital terrain model of Moscow Mountain as imaged by a 2003 LIDAR acquisition. So that's what's indicated here in gray, and I'll use my pointer. So you can actually see the individual flight lines from that 2003 LIDAR collection here in 2003, and the location in Idaho of Moscow, and Moscow Mountain is just to the north, is over here. So the repeat LIDAR that we used to quantify disturbance after 2003 due to harvest was actually two collections. We had an industry partner, Potlatch, that collected LIDAR over this small square as sort of an experiment. So it was about this time in 2007 where forest industry started getting particularly excited about using LIDAR for forest management applications. And then here in 2009 is the more extensive survey across Moscow Mountain, and this re-imaged the majority of the forested area of this 20,000 hectare gray polygon. The outline areas tend to be dominated by agriculture and not so much forest. Accompanying each of these LIDAR surveys from 2003, 2007, and 2009 were field surveys in the same years. Although I guess in the case of 2007, we actually measured the field plots a year later. So Moscow Mountain is an actively managed landscape. It covers 20,000 hectares, and we've done research on there for at least 10 years now. A former PhD student of mine published one of his PhD chapters mapping forest successional stages across Moscow Mountain, and I'm showing this figure as a way to illustrate the structural diversity across the mountain, and that's typical of an actively managed forest landscape. So it tends to be dominated by younger stands, mature stands that are getting closer to ready to harvest, and some of the old multi-story conditions indicated here in orange. And then in this depiction, based on the 2003 Lidar analysis, you can also see these outlying agricultural areas. Forgetting to use my pointer. Here it is. Indicated in the pale beige colors on the outside. Those are agricultural areas. And as I mentioned, each LiDAR survey had an accompanying field plot survey. So we were able to do a forest inventory using LiDAR and field plot data for 2003 and for the repeat collections. All of the field plots were consistently sampled following stratified random design, and the strata that we used to stratify the Muskoka Mountain landscape were elevation, slope, and aspect, and then we used a satellite-derived vegetation index as a way to indicate biomass. Now, in the latter surveys, we might have used the LiDAR collection directly, but we thought we would be consistent with the older studies in 2003 where we didn't have the LiDAR available at the time of stratification. And the point of the stratification is just to distribute the field plots across the full range of conditions in an unbiased manner. So that a satellite-derived vegetation index can suffice just fine for that purpose. Of the plots that were installed in 2009 and 2008, 75 of those actually were repeat measures. So 75 of the initial 84 plots initially placed in 84 were remeasured. The ones that were not were outside the repeat LiDAR collections, close to those agricultural lands on the edge. Oh, and I'll just mention that this photo is sort of to remind me to mention that this is a closed canopy forest. So it's there is some open canopy conditions on the southwest aspects, but for the most part, it's wet enough to be fairly productive and a closed canopy. So here are the LiDAR acquisition parameters for the surveys. They're actually fairly consistent. The altitude above ground varied, and that has an effect on the point density of the surveys. And then the LiDAR system used progressed from an ALS 40 to an ALS 50 in the latter two acquisitions. They had similar numbers of returns per pulse. That means the first return tends to be from the top of the canopy, and then if there are additional returns for a given pulse, they will get reflected either off the ground or off intervening canopy layers. It's very rare to get four returns for a single pulse. And one should not assume that first returns are only from the top of the canopy. A large proportion of the first returns actually go directly to the ground, and that's because canopy structure varies so much out in the landscape, including canopy gaps. The diameter of the footprint was very consistent, as was the scan angle. Back in 2003, this was prior to our understanding that it's better to keep scan angles less than 15 degrees on either side of nadir, and nadir is the 0 degrees directly below the aircraft to the ground. As you widen the scan angles, you start to get too much canopy interception and not enough penetration all the way to the ground. The major thing that changed with time and technological improvements was the reduced post spacing, or another way to say that is the increase in point density. These are inversely proportional variables. So back in 2003, it was less than 1 return per square meter, whereas in 2007, it's up to 6 returns per square meter, and then it doubled in another 2 years. So there's been a huge improvement in the ability to collect high-density LiDAR. And in fact, I just read something recently about how globally the amount of data available, especially these big data sets that you may have heard about, has doubled in just the last 2 years. And Lidar is a great example of big data. So to see that graphically, we can take a look at this figure. On the left is a cartoon forest, and I want to just show this animation of these fake footprints coming down from the aircraft and intercepting this canopy. So this is sort of the condition back in 2003, where most of the trees would probably get hit if they're a mature tree by a laser pulse. But some trees would not get intercepted, and the tops of these trees are not always intercepted. And so you can't rely on the LiDAR to always get the very tip of the trees. As the density increases, then it's more probable that the LiDAR will intercept the treetop. But then the proportion of returns that actually intercept through the canopy and reach the ground will remain the same regardless of the point density. So even if high-density systems are available, and that tends to be what's used now for forestry applications, it's important to just keep in mind that LiDAR is still a sampling system. It's fundamentally different from an imaging system like a satellite image. Now over here on the right is the depiction of the number of returns at the scale of an individual forest inventory plot. So these are, the two top figures are the overhead view of a 10th acre plot. So this is the number of returns in 2003 for an area that size. It's maybe 100 or so, or a couple hundred, but then it's 12 times the point density in 2009 over the same inventory plot. If you look at that same plot from the side, you can see the canopy elements sampled from the 2003 LiDAR, and you can see how more densely they're sampled from 2009. But note that the shapes are the same. And that's because of the consistency of LiDAR as a sampling tool for characterizing the canopy structure. And then even once you normalize the height returns for variations in ground topography, that's what these two bottom figures represent. So now this is just canopy heights alone, not including topographic heights, and you still see that characteristic structure being preserved. You see the same shapes in the side view of the LiDAR points. Note also this dotted line. So back in 2003, the mean height of the trees in this plot was about 6 meters, whereas in 2009, the mean height is about 9 meters. That's due to forest growth. So we're actually capturing growth with just the mean height metric calculated from the LiDAR returns. So this is a much fancier, colorful image that Ben produced. Now this is an area larger than the forest inventory plot I just showed in the previous slide. But you can see the individual trees, and so this is a depiction from the high-density LiDAR. Now in processing the LiDAR, we need to take all those XYZ points and extract the canopy heights from them. So the first step is to classify all the returns to identify which returns are ground and then which are vegetation. And then you interpolate the DTM from the ground returns. And once you have that DTM, which is typically calculated at 1 meter, you can subtract it from the point cloud to calculate canopy heights. So that's an effect normalizing the point cloud for topographic variation. And from there you can take the canopy heights and treat those as residuals and use those for the forestry applications. And then here is a depiction of that DTM, which is interpolated from the ground classified returns. So that's why it looks so flat. So it's just the ground returns alone. And those were the ground returns. Here's the DTM interpolated from it. Again, that's typically at 1 meters. And then here's the DTM underneath the point returns that were classified as vegetation returns. And so now when you color code those returns by canopy height, you can start to see better the height variation due to individual trees. Now what we need to do next is bin the LiDAR data, and we can do that in two ways. One, we can do it for the entire acquisition, and so we do that in square grid cells across the landscape. And in these figures, we've been doing it at 20 by 20 meter grid cells. The reason for doing it that size is because it's the same size as the 10th acre plots that are indicated over here, that are our forest inventory plots. So what the approach we prefer to take is to bin the LiDAR points within a plot size unit that's the same size as the grid cells. So the plots will form our model units to develop a model relating our inventory data measured on the ground to the LiDAR data binned within this plot. And then once we can develop a model across all of our inventory plots in the landscape, we can then apply the model to all of these gridded cells to form a predicted map. So all those points, when we bin them, we have a distribution of heights, and from those we calculate canopy metrics. And so this is a list of some of the canopy metrics that we calculate from the height returns. There's the minimum height near the ground, and then the maximum height, the tallest return above ground. The difference would be the range, and then etc. The mean, standard deviation, skewness and kurtosis show you the higher moments of the height distribution. The height percentiles of the height distribution are also useful metrics, etc. Now, associated with each XYZ LiDAR return is not just the Z value for height, but also an intensity value. That's like a brightness value varying from 0 to 255, an 8-bit range. And if you display those intensity values across the landscape, you can see the patterns. Here's a sample of the landscape. This happens to be a clear-cut area down here, while the darker areas, which are not quite as reflective, are older, mature forest. And so the fact that these intensity values shows the landscape in a meaningful pattern shows that there's useful information here. So we can take those data and calculate the same suite of metrics from the intensity as well. And then another type of metric that I found particularly powerful for predictive modeling are the density metrics. And so this is another physical measurement from the LiDAR that is enabled by the bin calculation. So within a bin, you've got a proportion of the total returns that are vegetation returns. So if you divide the vegetation returns above a certain height value, and by default we use breast height, and divide those by the total number of returns, you get a measure of canopy density, and that's a physical measurement. You can apply the same logical formula to vertical strata within the vertical canopy profile. And so we call stratum 0 the ground returns, that percentage, and then we call stratum 1 the vegetation returns between 0 and a meter in height. So that's indicative of understory. The standard deviation within stratum 1 is sort of a useful measure of ground clutter. And then stratum 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6 just get successively higher through the canopy. So they show you vertical slices through the canopy and where within the canopy these canopy elements occur. So this is something that you can't do with passive optical data, but it's something that's enabled by the active sensing characteristic of LiDAR. And these height thresholds for these strata are arbitrary. You can choose those depending on your needs. The final set of metrics that we use for predictive modeling are the topographic metrics. So the DTM itself is also useful information, and you can use elevation of the ground, you can use the slope, the aspect, slope aspect transformations. Aspect in particular is a powerful predictor variable for forest structure and composition, because As you all know, north-facing aspects in this part of the world tend to be more dense than south-facing aspects and have different species composition. So we can use those kinds of variables for predictive modeling too. So here are some results now. Moving on to results for this Moscow Mountain study. We have two independent models here, and our predictive modeling tool that we use is called Random Forest. And we made a model in 2003 and another model in 2009. So these box plots indicate distributions of importance values. An importance value is a measure of the predictor variable importance as assessed with the Random Forest predictive modeling method. So this is a machine learning algorithm, and it's typically a more powerful approach than, say, a regression model because it bootstraps through your data and it bootstraps through your predictor variables. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, these two figures, in that the bottom figure on the bottom variable on the y-axis is actually the most important predictor. So the ranking, they're sorted by importance. The ranking goes from high importance at the bottom to low importance at the top. But these are just the variables that were selected as important. So there's dozens of other metrics less important than these that were excluded from the predictive model. So our goal here is model parsimony. And as you can see, there's about 10 predictor variables for each of our models, both in 2003, 2009. So these names over here may not be too intuitive to you, but this is mean height, this is the 90th percentile of height, this is mean intensity, this is height kurtosis, height mode, stratum 4, so that's, I believe, between 10 and 20, or maybe it's 20 or 30 meters above ground, that canopy density. Here's the overall canopy density above breast height. Stratum 5 is the higher canopy density above stratum 4. Here is maximum height. And TRA, that's transformed aspect. And over here on the right, similar variables, the ones that differ a little bit in this independent model from the 2009 metrics. Here's an intensity metric, so that's the 25th percentile of intensity. Here's height skewness as a selected metric. And this is something here, HLI, is something called the hierarchical landscape index. So that's an additional topographic metric that was selected. So those were our predictive models. And if you plot the predictive above ground tree biomass on the x-axis based on the Lidar model versus observed on the ground from the plot data, we get a pretty good relationship along the one-to-one line, both in 2003 here on the left and then in 2009 here on the right. Then when you apply that model to the gridded Lidar metrics, okay, the same metrics that were selected by those respective models, you can produce a map. And so this is a 20 meter resolution map of the tree above ground biomass in 2003 above, and then in 2009 below. Now, I also need to mention our industry partners and our University of Idaho partner. So overlaid on these maps are stand polygons, and we used independent stand inventory information to assess the accuracy of our maps. The interesting thing, though, then to do is to look at the differences between those maps. So first of all, if we do those differences at the plot scale, we can estimate how much above ground biomass change was there. That's what's shown here on the x-axis. And then over here is what was observed based on just the plot measures. So this is for the 75 plots for which we had repeat measures. And I used a different symbology to indicate plots that were undisturbed, here as circles, and then plots that were disturbed as pluses. Now the field crews would record disturbance in the plots, but they would not record the level of disturbance, whether it was just a couple trees or if the whole thing was clear-cut. And so that's why there's considerable overlap between the circles and the pluses. So what I did I wanted to set a threshold of what I was calling disturbance due to harvest. So basing it on the field data, okay, the ground truth data, I chose a loss of 66 megagrams per hectare because that's the line you can draw that is just below all of the undisturbed plots. So I took it as undisturbed as being more accurate indication of the plot condition than the disturbance because I didn't know what level of disturbance based on the field data records. So having identified a threshold, I could then apply that to the maps to classify the maps. And so here now is the difference between the 2003 and 2009 biomass maps, subtracting one from the other. Now this map looks quite noisy, and that's due to the cumulative errors from the models, the measurements, the Lidar locational uncertainty, field plot uncertainty, all these additive errors. But the beige areas indicate essentially no change. The blue areas indicate an increase in forest biomass, and then the red areas show where there was a loss. And you can see how the red areas have shapes which correspond to, man-made activities. And so this 66 megagram per hectare threshold is what's classified in the darker red. And that's what we're calling disturbance due to harvest. So I mentioned those industry and University of Idaho partners, and they had independent stand validation data. So then when I plotted predicted tree biomass in 2003 versus 2009 in harvested versus non-harvested stands, basically binning the mapped pixels within those stand polygons, I got this interesting result where the non-harvested stands fall nicely along the 1-to-1 line with some variation around that. But then the harvested stands all fall down here because biomass in 2003 was, higher than in 2009 because the harvest occurred during those intervening years. And then over here, binning the change map within the harvest units. And these are actually different polygons. Over here are the actual forest stands from our partners. Over here are harvest polygons from our partners. So that was a nice form of validation of our approach. And my last results slide is here is just showing the accounting of the Muskoka Mountain study area overall. So taking those harvest polygons, we found that 26% of the landscape had actually been harvested in those 6 years, and this was the average biomass loss in those harvested areas. In the non-harvested areas, which is about 2/3 of the landscape, we had an increase of biomass of about 4 megagrams per hectare per year. So it's nice to be able to assign a growth increment like that. And this is just a tabular summary of the map. We did have some non-forest areas, those ag lands, about 6% of the landscape. This sort of tallying of using LIDAR to map biomass and then look at biomass change is going to become important in the future as we get more involved with carbon inventory and global carbon assessments. And so approximately half the biomass is composed of carbon. So it's pretty easy to calculate carbon change from the biomass change. So I think this sort of approach may be applied much more broadly, even globally. So in conclusion, I haven't talked much about random forest. I wanted to focus more on LIDAR and the disturbance that we're trying to map. But random forest is actually a really powerful predictive modeling tool. The LIDAR metrics, it's important to know that we calculated them in a consistent manner between our different LIDAR acquisitions so that even though we used independent models, we could then compare them because they were consistently processed. Using pre- and post-disturbance LIDAR definitely has utility for mapping forest biomass and biomass change. And I mean not just knowing where it happened, but actually to put quantitative numbers on the amount of biomass and biomass change. And as repeat LIDAR collections become more readily available, this is going to be an important tool for monitoring forests, not just at the landscape scale like I've shown here, but also globally. And to do that, it's going to be a while before we've got global LiDAR availability. So it's going to be important to integrate LiDAR samples with comprehensive data such as Landsat and other types of optical imagery that is already globally available. So I'm going to leave it now and turn it over to Ben to give you the other perspective for another type of disturbance and how we can approach trying to quantify that.
All right, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I'll take over. This is Ben, and I'll talk about another project that we did fairly recently, and it's similar, but there's some differences. And in our case, we were most interested in, we had all this data, this remotely sensed data and this field data, and we wanted to create these maps of bark beetle impacts. And in our case, in terms of basal area, we wanted to create some maps. So yeah, we had all this data. We had LandTrendr data, and I'll explain what that is. It's a Landsat product like Andy talked about. And on the map, you can see the hollow polygons showing where we had this Landsat product. Then the solid polygons, you can see there's a big one on the Kenai Peninsula of Alaska. We had LiDAR data as well. And then we also had in these same areas in the LiDAR acquisitions, we had field plot observations on the ground of live and dead trees. And so we had all this data, and we wanted to use it to create these maps. And also important, of course, is all these areas had been experiencing bark beetle outbreaks, spruce beetle outbreak, as well as mountain pine beetle outbreak. In Alaska and Arizona, it was primarily spruce beetles causing mortality, and bark beetles, I should say too. They kill trees. They're not just defoliating the trees, but in this case, spruce beetles and mountain pine beetles, they kill trees. So there were a lot of dead trees, and in Colorado and Idaho and Oregon, there were mountain pine beetles killing trees. So we had field data from lots of different sources for all these 5 study areas. Some of them, the field data was gathered for the purpose of projects, measuring bark beetle mortality. Some of them were for other purposes, just forest inventory. In Alaska and Oregon, we had forest inventory data for the United States. And in Oregon, we also had continuous vegetation survey data. And all these data were in fixed plots, and all of the trees had DBH, or diameter breast height measurements associated with them. So from that we could we used FES, some software, to summarize for each plot live and dead basal area. And there was quite a few plots in all, a few hundred.
That's shitty.
And Andy's already went into this, so I won't spend much time on it. But we again, just like Andy said, we produced several products from the LiDAR, because LiDAR comes in these huge point clouds that are millions, sometimes billions of points per acquisition. And to make that data more workable, it's helpful to summarize it into these metrics like Andy talked about, where you clip all the returns from like a plot, like our plots, we did this. You clip all the vegetation returns out and then summarize them into metrics like mean height, maximum height. The density metrics were important in this analysis, like Andy said as well. So it's very helpful to summarize them in this way, so they can be more easier to be used. And in our case, we produced our grids at 30-meter resolution, because we were also working with the Landsat data, which in our part of the world, it's about 30 meters in resolution. So LandTrendr, what is LandTrendr? It's a Landsat product, and it stands for Landsat-based detection and trends in disturbance and recovery. And Robert Kennedy developed it. And the graphic shows here on the upper right you take the whole Landsat archive for a certain area. The thematic map archive stretches from 1984 to present, in our case 2010, and there's a lot of information, as you can imagine, in this stack of images. It's a lot more information than just you get from a single image, so it's really useful for these sorts of analyses. And what it does is, for each pixel, it tracks the reflectance of that pixel through time. You can see in the graph below the stack of images on the right, there's this kind of darker line that's showing pixel reflectance through time, and it kind of jumps around, bounces up and down. There's noise in remote sensing data always. And what it does is it summarizes that trajectory, that pixel trajectory through time. So you can see that red line of just 2 line segments. That's LandTrendr algorithm has summarized for that pixel that there was an incline in reflectance, and then there's a clear cut, and as a result, reflectance is dropped down. And this information, as you can imagine, for forest disturbance is very useful, because there's a lot of variables you can generate from these trajectories, like disturbance magnitude, how the duration, how long has the disturbance lasted, and the magnitude of these disturbances, and recovery as well. And in our case, our variables were in terms of Landsat tassel cap brightness, greenness, and wetness. And just like for the Lidar metrics, where you can clip out all the LiDAR returns that are coincident with a plot, we clipped out the LandTrendr values that were coincident with a plot, and use these as additional variables to predict bark beetle mortality. Another very useful set of data that we use, in our case we didn't use it for our modeling, we used it as an independent data source for evaluating how well our maps were performing that we produced, is aerial detection survey data. This is data that's produced by the United States Forest Service, and how they produce this data is observers actually fly over the forest in planes and hand digitize from understand polygons that describe insect damage, and often they record the disturbance agent, what's killing the forest, or what's damaging the forest, and the density of that damage. And we use a product produced by Meddens, Ari Meddens, a former collaborator of mine, and he found some systematic biases in this data, and he produced this, corrected those biases and produced this grid data set on the scale of a kilometer grid, describing this mortality through time. And as you can see on the map, this is a map showing cumulative bark beetle caused mortality across the western United States. The warm colors indicate areas where mortality is quite severe. Blue is where it's less severe, and you can see there's a lot of blue, of course, so a lot of mortality isn't severe, but the area affected is quite large. A lot of forests have been affected by bark beetles, as I'm sure many of us know, and a lot of our study areas, we had to study in north central Colorado, central Idaho, and in central Oregon are quite affected. So it's a great data set and very useful in our case.
There's free knife sharpening.
So Andy talked a little about random forest. We also use random forest to relate this LiDAR information and this Landsat information. We wanted to use it to relate to, in our case, we predicted total live dead and percent dead basal area from these variables. And random forest was useful, especially in our case, because random forest is nonparametric, meaning your response variable, in our case these basal area variables, doesn't have to be normally distributed, which is often a requirement for more traditional statistical methods. It was nonparametric, and that's useful because our response variable was very skewed. A lot of areas, as the map showed, are very lightly impacted by bark beetles. There's maybe only 10 to 20% tree mortality, and actually a lot fewer areas are severely impacted where all the trees have been killed. And as Andy already said and showed, something very useful too that I like about random forest is it generates these variable importance measurements, which allows you to check, to see, does this model make sense? Are these variables important to predicting whatever I'm predicting? Does it make sense? And what's most important? And as Andy said, it's been used quite a few times by us and others, and it seems to make some good models. So we combined all of our observations from all of our 5 study areas to create one large model that kind of stretched across all of them, and apply these models to each of these study areas. So mapping again, after you create these models, you can input all these grids that like forest density, disturbance magnitude from LandTrendr, change in tassel cap wetness, what was the wetness before as compared to the wetness after disturbance, and those are the inputs, and you can put these into your random forest model. In our case, we did all of our work in R, and the output is a % dead basal area map. It's spatially explicit across our study areas, and we produced our maps at 30 meters, but to compare with the gridded aerial detection survey product of Aryan, we bend it to 1 kilometer, so there was comparable resolutions. So now I'm on to results. So this figure is showing, I guess the main point of it is that our field data, the plot data is the solid line on these graphs. The aerial detection survey data is the dotted or dashed line, and it's showing distributions of tree mortality across our study areas and also across all of our areas. And the point of this is it was promising, and it's good to see this because it shows that our plots, which just sample the landscape, sample a very small part of the landscape, approximate, or the distributions of our plots approximate the distributions found on the landscape of mortality. And as I said, it's a very dead % tree mortality is caused by bark beetles is a very skewed variable. There's a lot of areas that are only lightly impacted and very few areas relatively heavily impacted. And only one study area, Colorado, where we had a big difference between what our plot sampled and what was actually on the landscape. And I think that's because they wanted to measure a lot of dead trees, so they located plots where there were a lot of dead trees.
All right. Wow.
So how well did our models perform? We explained moderate levels of variation in basal area. So for our best models, about 50 to 60% of the variation in total live dead and % dead basal area were explained by our models that use Lidar and LandTrendr. And as we expected, because there's other studies that have done similar things, the Lidar variables were the best at predicting total and live basal area. They are sufficient for that, and they did a pretty good job. But what was exciting, and as Andy said at the first, that Lidar data, it's not going to replace necessarily these older data types like Landsat. It's definitely very useful, but Landsat data and the spectral information, and especially LandTrendr, where you can, and similar algorithms where you can make use of that, dense temporal resolution, or not dense, but quite a few years of temporal changes. That's still very useful, and in our case, it was more useful than Lidar for predicting dead and % dead basal area. And real quickly, some of the important variables, they're highlighted in yellow.
I have a question.
Canopy density was important for total and live.
Ben?
Yes?
I have a question. 2 slides ago, I was wondering, what do you think is going on in Colorado where the 2 plots or the 2 lines were not? What do you think is going on there?
Oh, I think it's just the plots, for whatever reason. I'm actually not sure the reason. The plots that we used, 113 plots there. The distribution mortality there, it's found on the plots, was heavily skewed towards lots of dead trees. But I'm fairly confident, though, just from looking at maps of mortality as produced by us and the ADS data, that mortality wasn't in fact that extreme across the whole landscape. I don't think across all, a whole Landsat scene of worth of forest that 80% of the forest was killed. I mean, there are areas where 80% of the trees are killed, but I think for the most part across the whole landscape, I think the mean, is maybe more down 20 to 30% of the trees are killed. Nevertheless, the mortality in Colorado is quite severe. It's quite heavily impacted by the bark beetle, mountain pine beetle, and some spruce beetle. Actually, spruce beetle is kind of ramping up in Colorado at the moment. Does that answer your question? All right, I'll go back to, so again, just briefly, dead and percent dead base area were better predicted by these LandTrendr variables. Pre-disturbance greenness, change in wetness were important, disturbance magnitude. And we compared our maps to those of ADS, aerial detection surveys, and correlations were moderate. The correlations between LandTrendr data and the aerial detection survey, or LandTrendr models and the aerial detection survey data were a little better, also showing that LandTrendr and the Landsat archive is just a little better at predicting and capturing variation in dead basal area. And the reasons for our correlations weren't too great, and we decided a lot of that was, first of all, the random forest models that we use to produce these maps, they're only explaining moderate levels of variation. So when you use a model to produce a map, that map's going to have that same error. So there's errors in the models that led to errors in the maps. Also, aerial detection survey data isn't necessarily the truth. It's a useful data set for sure, but there's missing years. Not the whole United States isn't flown every year. Definitely, there's only parts flown, so there's missing data, and also it's a lot of different surveyors, some with differing levels of experience. There's some subjectivity in that data set. Also, very largely causing some of this confusion too is forests are, over the course of 30 years, the forest changes a lot. There's a lot of different disturbance. Harvest, not all insect damage is lethal. There's a lot of defoliation. And fire is a very important disturbance, of course, in forests. So our LandTrendr variables were picking up all of this disturbance, not just the insect mortality. And so here's an example of some of the maps we produced. This is the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, where there's spruce beetle mortality, and the LandTrendr map is probably better, and it's an estimate, but you can see that across the whole Kenai Peninsula we can produce this map and show some of that variation, maybe give an indication of where mortality is greatest. And lastly, more maps showing all of our study areas, and you can see in Colorado that this is where the correlations are greatest, that the biggest source of disturbance in Colorado, at least for this small area of Colorado, was mountain pine beetle, and the correlation is pretty high between our aerial detection surveys, or the aerial detection survey data, and our LandTrendr produced maps. And Idaho also shows that there's a lot more going on in these forests. Central Idaho has had a lot of fire in the last 30 years. Fire is indicated by these hollow red polygons, and you can see how the LandTrendr model, our map, is picking up a lot of that disturbance. So in conclusion, we decided that remote sensing data is a useful way to map this disturbance. It can do a decent job at detecting it, and that LiDAR is still just great if you just want to predict total live base area. It's probably the best thing to use if you have it. But there's a lot of information in this Landsat archive that you can utilize for these sorts of things, and it's useful. In our case, it was very useful for predicting dead basal area. And also wanted to mention too that this Landsat product, or Landsat time series products, are being processed for the entire U.S. to help with these sorts of things, and they'll become available, I'm sure, more and more for lots of areas. We're using it for other projects, so it's definitely a useful type of data to use for these sorts of analyses. And we wanted to acknowledge the Big Sky Carbon Partnership and Agenda 2020 and the U.S. Forest Service for funding, and Lee Verley, Mike Fulkowski, Alistair Smith, Jeff Evans, and a lot of field help helped a lot to make these projects possible. So we couldn't do it without them. And I'll mention too that if anybody wants to talk more about this sort of stuff, I'm sure Andy and I would be very happy to take emails and talk more about it, because we like this stuff. All right, that's it. And I guess we have a few questions, so I'll try and answer those. And Andy, I guess you can jump into a question from Jason. Can this data be used for I-tree streets like analysis for carbon sequestration? The cost of a survey. Andy, yeah, I know my study area, how many hectares was that? I did this for my thesis. I gathered a bunch of Lidar. It's around for about, I don't know actually. Andy, do you have an idea of what the cost of a Lidar acquisition is?
Well, if you get a really good deal, it's about $1 an acre. More typical would be a couple dollars per acre, but that's really contingent on how big the area is. So the bigger the area, the more the cost goes down. And if the particular vendor has to fly the plane a long way just to get there, that's going to increase the cost too. But definitely LiDAR would be applicable to this issue that you mentioned. So carbon sequestration, of course, but then rainwater diversion. So one of the driving forces for getting LiDAR flown is hydrological applications or road building. LiDAR can be used to see old roads beneath the forest canopy. They stick out like a sore thumb, even like deer and elk trails, the heavily used ones you can see in the LiDAR DTM. So it's useful data for sure, and if you could get that area flown for $10,000, I think that'd be a pretty good deal.
I imagine the cost has probably come down quite significantly from when you guys were doing this in 2003. Is that correct, or?
It's actually been surprisingly stable. Hasn't changed much. You're just getting more data for the dollar. I mean, I guess data per dollar, if that's your metric, that's been increasing a lot, but the cost per acre has stayed pretty stable. And I think that may be because there's pretty good competition out there and more vendors available to handle the increasing demand.
All right, it looks like we have maybe one more question from Carl coming in. I'm going to open back up the pods here so we can, or the polls, so we can get feedback from our.
I'll just make a couple more comments. I see these comments kind of floating in. Yeah, a lot of the LiDAR data that's out there is county level, and the counties that are getting flown sooner tend to be the urban counties or those in low-lying coastal plains. So because of the need to update the national elevation data set with the cutting-edge technology that LiDAR provides. So for that kind of floodplain and flood planning, these LiDAR collections are really essential. Oh, and then here's a question about drones. Yeah, so there's people working on that for sure, getting different kinds of sensors on drones. Because LiDAR is an active system, it's quite a bit heavier, then a passive optical remote sensing system. You know, you can consider your digital camera a passive optical system because the sun is supplying the light to provide the signal for your photograph. But with LiDAR, it has to provide the energy. And so I haven't seen any drone LiDAR systems yet that could provide data that I would want to use, that, you know, you could get sort of calibrated data from that. But it's coming. Drones are getting bigger and LiDAR systems are getting smaller and more capable, so it's definitely on the horizon.
Well, that I think that wraps up our discussion. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to present to us, and I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thanks again. And one thing I wanted to mention, if you are tuning in today and you are tuning in as one person, but there are maybe 5 people or 3 people watching the webinar, if you could just send me or Meredith